Thank you. Thanks to the American Consumer Institute. So Harry explained the amazing things that broadband is doing today, and Hans explained some of the amazing things that we'll be able to do with broadband tomorrow, and Morgan handed out some pieces of paper.
All right.
So I'll try to explain how we get from where we are today to where we want to be from a governance standpoint. There are a lot of rules that govern phone companies, as we all know. Some go back to 1996, some go back to 1934. The problem is that a lot of these rules that exist today make pretty much no sense. Whatever one thinks about how much sense they made in the past, it's hard to justify them today. So here's one of the many statistics I'll throw out. A decade ago, pretty much everybody had a regular, plain old wireline phone connection at their home. Some people had two, one for the dial-up and one for regular phone calls. Today that number is actually down to 26%. The remainder is people who have wireless, or they get their voice from the fiber optic provider or cable company. Yet these operators of plain old telephone systems are saddled with all of these rules that other companies aren't. Things like forced interconnection, as Hans explained, where they have to give access to competitors at wholesale rates. Unbundling. There's all of these technical legal rules that go on and on for hundreds of pages. So right now, some telecom companies want to stop operating this obsolete, outdated network. It's expensive, demand is dwindling, and it's really not competitive with what you can get from other providers. So there's this proceeding going on at the FCC that's being called the IP transition. The question is, how quickly will we get to a state where the firms that want to move forward and build better, more advanced networks and modernize their systems are going to be able to do that? The problem is that we have all these rules. Now, fortunately, one of the smart things that Congress did when it wrote our telecommunications laws is give the FCC the power to what's called forbear from regulating. The FCC doesn't always have to enforce a rule if it deems, among other things, that the rule is no longer necessary, that it's not in the public interest, and so forth. So there's this proceeding right now where the FCC is looking at proposals to conduct trials. Now, normally when a company wants to go to build a better product, to modernize its system, it doesn't have to go to a government agency and ask for special permission to conduct trials. It just does it. Maybe it'll do trials by itself, but it's going to be voluntary. But what we have now, because of this regulatory structure, is the FCC basically being the essential obstacle to what could be and will likely be a much better network of tomorrow. So unfortunately, even though the FCC is moving forward with this process and saying, okay, to the companies, you can proceed, it's doing so very slowly. It's going through a series of comments and asking for more information, and this is already dragged out for a year, and it's going to probably drag out for several more years. What this does is not just make it harder to get a landline, because no one really cares all that much about those anymore. What it means is that if a company is thinking about building a fiber optic network in an area where it's currently just offering copper and DSL, this structure creates disincentive to do so, because it means you might have to maintain the old copper network at the same time as you're building a new fiber network and have to operate two networks. Or there's always the risk, and the FCC has discussed this possibility publicly, that fiber could be re-regulated the way that the copper networks were back in the 1990s, where everything is the subject of forced unbundling. Now, there are lots of legal arguments that Randy and others have explained why the FCC probably doesn't have the authority to do a lot of these things, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be a particularly effective constraint on this or many other agencies. So we have to make policy arguments for why we want to allow companies to build better networks. We want fiber to grow and thrive so that it can compete with cable companies who, according to some people, are going to become the next monopolist if they aren't already. So we want to be fostering competition, and these old regulatory regimes get in the way of it. And this isn't just a problem with voice. Look at video. I spent a few too many hours over this past weekend watching Arrested Development on Netflix. The idea of accessing video over a platform that has no facilities, that isn't providing cable channels, that isn't a broadcaster, that wasn't something that Congress ever considered when it wrote the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And yet, the way we treat cable channels and so-called MVPDs there are all these rules that, again, they've been called silos, and they are, but they're silos with differential treatment, where we'll say that some cable channels can't be bundled with a cable company that owns the channels, and if they do, they're governed by this additional set of rules. And even the Netflix example is also the subject itself of disparate treatment. So Netflix, according to the latest data, and correct me if I'm wrong, Morgan, it consumes about 1/3 of internet traffic.
At night.
At night. Yep. That's a huge number, and that's not a bad number. That's a good thing. That means people really want to watch Netflix, and that could change in 5 years. It could be Vudu or Hulu or something else. But this is a clear indication that people are moving toward new and creative ways of consuming video that we didn't used to see. Yet the ordinary way, the traditional way that we price that is the content company Netflix basically pays to get its data to the core of the internet. This is the traditional way. And then the ISP, or in other words, the consumers, pay to get the data from the backbone of the internet to their home. That's the gist of it. Yet, why does that have to be the pricing model of the future? Why can't more creative agreements be negotiated? A lot of innovation isn't just about building the next big thing, the next new technology, the next widget, the next service. It's about figuring out how to monetize it, how to market it, how to create a business model that allows that innovation to become sustainable and become accessible. Yet we have the so-called open internet order, also known as net neutrality, which says essentially that if an internet provider goes to Netflix and actually wants to use some of its leverage, Netflix gets a lot more bargaining power because of the fact that it has no obligation to give its content to anyone. Except for the antitrust laws, which are based on economic reasoning, unlike the net neutrality rule. Netflix has the choice whether to offer to tie its products, to offer exclusively to some ISPs and not to others. Yet internet providers don't have that kind of authority. So the point is that there are these rules that exist today, that some of which have been promulgated by the FCC on its own, others which originate out of laws going back to 1996, 1934. Not to mention all the compulsory copyright rules, which are a whole other set of laws that were created in an era of a completely different set of competitive realities that need to be revisited. The agency needs to be forbearing from regulation, and when they don't, Congress needs to step in and rewrite the law and say to the agency, to the FCC, that it cannot impede this transition to an all-IP world, to the packet switch world, because it is going to enable a lot of great things, but 5 years delay can be a real impediment to growth, to people using cool services. I mean, imagine if the internet today were 5 years behind where it is. You know, we wouldn't be using tablets. We'd still be using like razors or something. That's not the world we want to live in, and it's the job of Congress to make sure that government isn't standing in the way. And that's probably going to require rewriting some of the laws. There's a debate going on about how to do that. It's a challenge, but the reality is there is going to be a need for Congress to intervene in this market, because there's just not enough indication that innovation is going to be unleashed at the rate that it needs to be because of all these rules that stand in the way. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.